You're listening to the Sketchnote Army podcast. I'm your host, Mike Rohde, the author of the Sketchnote Handbook and the Sketchnote Workbook, and this is the podcast where I chat with sketchnoters and visual thinkers and try to understand what makes them tick. Hey, are you looking for the ideal sketchbook for your sketchnoting practice? The Sketchnote Idea Book is the sketchbook designed for sketchnoters. Equipped with no bleed, no show-through paper, you can take almost any marker or pen you can throw at it. Get 10% off with code ARMY at airship.store. Hey everyone, it's Mike and I'm here with Blanche Ellis. Blanche, welcome to the show. It's so good to have you.
Thank you, Mike. Really nice to be here, and I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Yes, me as well. We've run across each other, I think on LinkedIn. I saw some of your graphic recording work. Thought it was really unique and interesting. Wanted to have you on the show. So let's just begin right at the beginning. Tell us who you are and what you do.
Okay, so I am a multidisciplinary artist. I've always done quite a number of things, often at once, which I think happens a lot to creative people. So I'm a visual artist. I have my own practice of painting and drawing. I use graphics to facilitate the flow of ideas for other people and with organizations and workshops, mostly with graphic recording, also a little bit with animation, a little bit with, or quite a lot with kind of behind the scenes graphics. So not live, but working from conversations, documentational thoughts. And then I'm also a musician and I'm a songwriter. So I've spent quite a lot of years doing that in multiple forms as well. And
wow,
it all kind of wraps in then, bit of poetry, bit of dance, a little bit of anything you can think of, really. But those are my
really
main.
Fascinating. So I'm curious. You touched on musician. Are there certain instruments that you like to play? Are you more of a vocal artist? Like, tell me a little bit about that. I'm just kind of curious.
Yeah, no, the voice is definitely my home. That's like
okay.
The voice is my first instrument, and singing harmonies is possibly the best feeling that I know in the world. And instruments, yes. I don't consider myself like a great instrumentalist, but I play guitar, I play banjo. I use those to, do songwriting, and I perform with that. And I even used to be in a band for a few years playing the washboard, doing harmonies and
Really?
playing the washboard. Yeah.
Wow.
But mostly it's guitar and banjo. And then
interesting. It sounds a little bit like Americana or bluegrass or something along those lines is the style I think of when I hear those instruments.
Yeah, well, quite folk. So I think sort of
folk music. Yeah, that's the word I was looking for. Folk.
Poets with guitars, I think, is a good description of a lot of the music that I love. Joni Mitchell, Leonard Cohen, that whole crew, and the ballad writers. So storytelling for me is a large part of it, like the music in itself and the rhythm and the physicality of that goes beyond words. But then also the storytelling element is very strongly close to my core. Yeah.
And I would guess too that we've touched a little bit on using music and vocals for telling a story. So I would guess that maybe that's what's drawn you to this, if we come back to the focus of the show, which is more visual thinking, using those same techniques, but with a different part of yourself to either live capture what you're hearing and express it, or like you said, taking recorded bits or research or those things and turning it into something that sort of encapsulates or consolidates that information. Is that a fair way to kind of guess at how those things are working in the way you work?
Yeah, I think there's a really strong connection there of sort of narrative seeking, which I kind of think of as, in a way, kind of pulling on threads. And you can do it through music, or you can do it through visuals, you can do it through writing, kind of pulling on threads and weaving. That's the sort of feeling of it. And so thinking with visuals was definitely something I did. I was the doodling kid in class always. Let's see, I don't know, like before I even knew that this existed, sketchnoting, graphic recording, I took some speeches or books that were really affecting me and turned them into, not exactly comics because I didn't have that style, but visual vignettes that for me communicated that idea and opened it up in a new way. So I think that's kind of connected.
And again, in a form, that's in a way a story, right? You're telling the story of the thing that's impacting you. So again, here we are back at narrative again. It's sort
Yeah.
of this core that draws you.
Yeah, and they both have an
That's really
emotional
fascinating.
element because you've got like the bare
Mm,
facts and you've got sort of just putting things down. But I guess I chose things that affected me. So at the time, what was it? One
mm,
was a book. It was actually a book by a Finnish architect about space and how we design space
mm,
and how we live in it, and the multi-sensorial nature of space. Um, in contrast to how everything in the modern world is designed, a lot of space is designed visually without considering how it would feel, how it would smell, how it would,
mm,
you know, the enveloping senses. So, anyways, that book, and then I felt very strongly about that. And the other one I can think of was like a speech by Neil Gaiman about,
mm,
I think it was one of those, what are they called when everyone finishes university in the States and they give a commencement speech or something, or ending speech.
yeah.
I can't
Yeah.
remember what it's
Commencement
called.
address. Yeah.
But there
Hmm.
was a really beautiful one that captured that. And there's emotion to song and there's emotion in the weight of a line. And that
Hmm.
is something in the narrative that it can't be sort of stripped back to bare facts. It's another
Hmm.
layer.
Hmm.
Mm.
Interesting. It's fascinating how these all fit together. And you mentioned too that you sort of have a lot of things going on at the same time. I feel the same way.
Yeah.
I suspect other listeners to the show feel similarly. Like I lately have gotten into making pizza and sourdough bread, and I see
Mm.
the same things involved in that as well. Like being willing to start something and get it moving, but then you have to wait until it's ready. Like you can't rush sourdough bread in bulk fermenting, right? It takes 5 hours or whatever it takes to get to the place where then you can work with it, right? So that in some ways, the work that we do is a little bit like that sometimes, I guess.
Mm. Yeah. And that's
So,
been actually, it's really well described and it's a really good learning that maybe took me years with I think when I moved into doing it professionally, was I sort of
mm-hmm,
thought that the work was when I had my pen on the page, you know, pushing the lines forward to the final piece, and it took time to kind of recognize the value of the the reflective work
mm,
of taking in the information, letting it move around, making lots of trials and experiments. There's parts um, that work well under pressure, and there's other parts it's just they're going to take as long as they take to get
mm-hmm,
to just the right point. Mm.
mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty fascinating. So it sounds like professionally, at least, it sounds like mainly what you would do is the graphic recording, graphic facilitation. Is that a fair guess, or where do you would you say your the
Mm.
core of your work is? Maybe that's the way to say it.
The core of my work has been graphic recording,
Mm, okay.
more than facilitation, although that's something I'm kind of sidestepping more into now from a
Mm,
different angle,
mm-hmm,
but much more listening and digesting and giving back the information. The facilitation, I think, happens mostly behind the scenes. Whereas I think of
mm,
graphic facilitators maybe as someone who's standing up and leading the workshop. I love to
mm-hmm,
work with facilitators because then
mm-hmm.
I think you really get the best out of the visuals because you can
Right.
arrange, you can do interactive pieces, and create a more whole experience. And yeah, so a lot of facilitation behind the scenes, and that's been part of it as well, learning to guide clients, guide people who want visuals, but they don't quite know what that looks like or how that could
Mm,
happen. And every job is
mm-hmm.
different. I don't know if you experience this.
Yeah, of course it
Um,
is. Yeah.
but yeah, so a large part of this kind of work is that there is no cookie cutter and someone comes along and they have this much information and they want it to have this much impact or this much information and they want the result to be something, really
Fit in here.
small and punchy, um, you know, 60 pages in one easy to read graphic. And you're like, okay, so um, let's, work out what's possible within this field. Um, yeah. And that's kind of a dance that's
Mm,
always going on. And that's, I think, where my facilitation part goes. And then the graphic recording, I kind of love just being the vessel. Like the information
mm,
comes in, resonates, finds images, finds connection. Okay, back out onto the page. And
mm,
that's something more like a dance or flow of a
mm-hmm,
different kind.
mm. That's really interesting. I've seen the work that you've done is really beautiful. It's got a certain style to it that is very unique to you, I think.
Mm.
Maybe that's because of your background with visualization, drawing, and painting and such. It just has a different, like, when I look at graphic facilitation sometimes, or graphic recording, sometimes it can sort of fall into very similar looking styles.
Mm,
I think a little bit of that maybe comes from where you're trained from, right, and what your background is. I can clearly see that you've got skills, artistic skills that you're applying in this way. That sort of sets you apart a little bit. That's just me reacting to what I've seen, which I think is great. I think it's really sets you apart, and probably is why people want to work with you. I would hope.
mm. Yeah, I hope to. Oh, it's interesting to hear that because I think often a style is easier to see from the outside than from the inside. Like I feel like I have lots of
Yeah.
variety and but I have that in my personal work as well. I think there's loads of variety, and then
Mm,
someone who knows me or doesn't know me will come along and be like, "Yeah, but these all are clearly by the same person." Um, so there's something in that. I think there's a very strong part of my practice that comes from drawing on the London Underground, like years
mm,
and years and years of living in London, being a musician and a graphic recorder, and to be honest, a creative odd jobs person for many years, like doing
mm,
so many
mm,
things and always on the move, 2 or 3 hours on the metro, well, the London Underground every day, and just drawing and drawing and drawing people. So you never knew how
mm.
long you had. You weren't going to see the people again. The stakes were low.
Right.
The variety and the diversity of people was really high.
Mm,
And everyone's in their own world. So you can just, I mean, I think that's a great tip just for drawing in general is
mm,
drawing on public transport, which loads of people do it, but it's, so I learned that kind of like to speed and summarize
mm.
expressions and scenarios in that kind of,
Speedy capture, I guess, in a sense, right? You didn't have,
yeah,
like you said, the next stop, that person might get up and walk away, and
yeah.
you hope that you've caught enough to sort of capture their essence as much as you can in that 2 minutes or whatever you have.
Yeah, and it's a similar feeling to the graphic recording when the words are flowing
Mm,
past and you're like, I
mm-hmm,
only have this moment to capture it. I can't capture everything. What am I going to
mm-hmm,
go for? And it's kind of exciting and stimulating as well. It's, it's
mm.
something about life and movement that, a static document, you could read it today or later or never.
Right.
But information that's in flow, whether that's visual or auditory, is, um, yeah, gives that kind of speed, deep connection to go to
Mm.
the essence. Mm.
So oddly enough, as you talked about that, I almost had the sense that you were like a fisherman or a fisher person standing in the stream, like which fish, putting your hook out and hoping you grab the most interesting things and bring them to shore or something. I don't know.
I like that. And then you're like, right, so this is what I've got now. How do I make a great meal?
Yeah.
We connect it all up.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Enjoying this episode of the Sketchnote Army podcast? Visit sketchnotearmy.com/buymeacoffee to say thanks. Well, this leads me to the next question, which is really common in the show, is tell us about your origin story. How did you get to this place? Because there are a lot of people that do graphic recording and do the kind of work you do. Obviously, you have a unique style. I can see it immediately. So going back to maybe when you're even like a little girl, like you
Mm,
said that you were the one who's doodling, just like, I was always doodling and drawing, making something. Talk to me about that process. What led you to this place, and what were the key, I guess, pivot points or turning points or influence points that led you to
mm.
where you are now? That's really fascinating to me.
So it's a long, all right. So,
We have time. We have time.
um, so thinking back that far in school, I think part of using visuals to process information, which is something that I wouldn't have conceived of at that time. And,
Right.
this kind of
Yeah.
phraseology is pre-verbal, basically.
Hmm.
So putting information into drawings, sorry, I think that could come in no small part because I had very strong dyslexia as a kid. My words were,
Mm.
letters were upside
Hmm.
down and backwards. My mathematics was non-existent. And in fact, when I started school and started writing, what I wrote appeared to be gibberish, and which confused the teachers because they were like, she can
Hmm.
talk perfectly well, she's understanding, but you pick up the page, there's no understanding. And then actually, what happened was one day, it was my dad after work, he took my exercise book at school and joined up all the words, read them out phonetically, and then re-separated them. And it was something that
Hmm.
made sense but it was just I'd made up my own visual code because I didn't get
Mm-hmm.
what other people were doing. Um, so I guess that was some sort of creative solution, even though not one that worked.
Interesting. Yeah.
Um, and then, yeah, that layer of like some kinds of communication being more difficult for me meant that I lent on others more strongly.
Mm.
Um, and visual communication is definitely one of those. Um, so there was that. And then I think part of it is being one of the people who never stopped, because we all do
Mm.
this as children and to some degree or another. And there's a sort of beautifully simple element of just like being allowed to carry on or not stopping
Mm.
because it's a strong enough push. Meaning that I carried on. I had sketchbooks all the way through school. I think it was an art teacher who first suggested I draw on the London Underground at age 14 or something. And I just started and never stopped. And now I'm, in my mid 30s and it's still like the main
Still
part of
part
my
of you.
practice. Yeah.
Mm.
And also I studied literature. So that's what I went to study after
Mm.
school. Literature and creative writing, American literature and
Mm.
creative writing, which is how I ended up
Interesting.
studying in the States for a year.
Mm.
And that all connects with storytelling. So at the
Mm-hmm.
end of my degree in American literature, I ended up focusing on oral folk tales.
Okay.
And yeah, and so my love of folk art, folk music just grew and grew and grew, and storytelling, and
Mm.
the idea that, first of all, that stories they belong to everyone, they are
Mm.
accessible, they are living things that, at least in folk music, folk art, folk stories, they don't belong to anyone in particular. It's
Mm.
information in flow in community, and it normally serves a purpose: education, catharsis, passing on learning, creating connection.
Mm-hmm.
It's really innate and natural and belongs to like the very first humans that we have any evidence of, and we
Mm-hmm.
just update the ways in which we use that. So yeah, so I studied all of that, and then feel free to push prompt me or ask any questions because I'm
Mm.
just jumping all over the place here. But so I came out of university, and I think actually I studied literature instead of art because my idea was like, oh, in art you don't get jobs, and for
Mm.
some reason I thought that in literature you do. In my world that I was in, that sort of made it made more sense. Like, I don't know, maybe you can be a journalist. And I used to say to people, oh,
Mm.
I'll be a journalist because it was the only thing I could think of that sort of made sense of my studies.
Active writing, yeah, every day, yeah.
Exactly. And I came out of university and I didn't think I was going to be a journalist.
Mm.
And I was like, what am I going to do? And I went to some interviews. I still had this idea that being in an office, chained to a computer, 9 to 5, was like, that's what being a grown up meant. And I was going to have to do that at some point. And I was just playing around until like that happened to me, and then I'd be in it forever. Like, I really, really thought it was like, that's how life is going to go. And then I would go to these interviews and just shoot myself in the foot because I didn't want the job. Like,
Yeah.
never get the call back. And in the meantime, I was going to meetups all around London, anything to do with arts. So
Mm.
meetups for people working in the arts, for artists, for professionals, for gallerists, for anything. Just talking to people, telling them what I love to do, and just, yeah, discovering really. And at some
Mm.
point, someone, and it was in North London in a pub garden with quite like dim lights. And so I can't remember the face of the person that I had this conversation
Mm.
with. But at that moment, they were sort of like my guardian angel because they told me that this job, graphic recording, existed.
Mm.
As I told them what I like to do and how I describe things with visuals, and they were like, that's a job, right? I sometimes work with
Mm.
this agency that do this, and they gave me the name, and I gave those people a call and went to a very informal interview where they
Mm.
essentially sort of pointed at a wall and said, "Draw while I talk." I was like, "Okay." And I walked away and I was like, no idea what happened with that. And then they gave me
Yeah.
a call and sent me on a 3-day job for like a big trade show in South
Well, that's pretty
London
quick. That's pretty
with
quick.
with three other artists because we always worked on teams for these big
Okay.
jobs, and it was essentially like sink or swim. Like this is your trial
Mm,
job, but like 3 days of it, which
yeah.
was great because I had time to like really get into it. Um, and I never refound that person. I asked the people in place. I
Mm.
was like, "Do you know who that is?" Like, so that person just
Maybe it was an
appeared.
angel.
Yeah, a
Interesting.
graphics angel. Um, yeah. So then I worked with them for years, and it was a sort of freelance structure, small family business
Mm,
based in
hmm.
London, and a freelance structure. Um, I was still doing lots of other jobs sort of around it, and we always worked on teams, almost always. It was like 2 to 4 people, and I loved that. And there was a simplicity to this is before I had my business, so someone else was doing all of the client work, all of the stuff that I
Mm.
now really appreciate as being
Yeah,
like
a lot of work.
60% at least of
Yeah.
the job. Um, and but you just get the call, the first one to answer the email, first ones that get sent on the job, and take a train, get your materials, take a train, set up,
Mm.
find out, someone hands you the agenda. If you're lucky, off you go.
Yeah.
And you sort of you find like a working rhythm, like a dance with the other people you're working with, tag teaming the talks and sharing tips and styles and going along. And then at the end of the day, then bam, off home. Um,
Mm.
and
Job is done.
that was a lot of learning, like very fast learning.
Mm.
Mm.
But it did sound like, that you'd sort of prepared yourself for that with all the work that you'd done. Because obviously they wouldn't have just sent you out with the other two people if they didn't think you were at least potentially capable of doing it, right? If
Yeah,
they didn't think you were qualified, there would have been, yep, see you later. Never heard a call from them. So obviously you impressed them enough to send you. Of course, they hedged their bets, right? They at least had two other people that wouldn't mess it up, right? I'm sure that they must have had to think that way. Or,
yeah. No, I mean the interview was informal, but they had their criteria. So they're like,
mhm,
in a essentially because it's kind of recreating the circumstances of graphic recording, like an
right,
improv,
right,
little information, potentially, how do you perform under pressure? How do you,
yeah,
and what can you do? And of course, uh, the main thing, apart from being able to make reasonable lines on a page, the main thing with graphic recording is listening, So
right,
all of
right,
literature studies and I think all of the kind of studies and the interest that I had in, I think, beyond formal studies, the interest I have in studying life, and the work that I'd done visually and visual summaries that all kind of fed into the work. I like to go
mm,
beyond keywords. I think sometimes graphic recording can be pushed
keyword
too
heavy.
far down into the summary, and I sometimes find I write a little bit more than other colleagues, but
Mm,
then also like for me, there's so much contact in the details, and of course it's a balance. You put too much in, and it's not accessible. But
mm,
I really do think that the details sometimes give the flavor and the human connection, and I think I don't know if that comes from studies and things or is just the way that I feel about
mm,
information and connect with it. It's in the songwriting as well.
mhm,
But so there's a wordsmithery, I think, that's connected to the graphic recording apart from
mm.
the visual
Like a
part.
smithery is like a smith, where you're
Yeah.
hammering on, horseshoes or something with a hammer.
Yeah. It's like a really old fashioned word. I don't know where I got that.
Yeah.
Um, but I like the idea because it's sort of like exactly it's like the tangibility of like physically working
Mm,
a material, and I think you can do that with sound. You can do that with words and this
yeah.
wordsmithery. Yeah.
Well, the thing that struck me when you talked about your history, the one that stuck out to me was the folk storytelling.
Mm.
So you think about where that's coming from. It's people who are probably illiterate in the written sense, maybe, in those folk environments,
Hmm.
where the story was everything, right? You said it belonged to everyone and they would share it.
Yeah.
Um, but I would think so you have to be a good storyteller on the one hand. So that's the outbound. What
Mm.
about the inbound? Like everyone, because of that environment, that culture, that expectation, that there's sort of an expectation of good listening because if you don't listen, you're going to miss the nuance and the the beauty of the storytelling. So there's sort of an expectation that your listening skills have to be up to par, and that's sort of bound into it too, which you don't think about it until you start thinking about the context. So I would think that your listening skills probably improved quite a bit in
Mm.
those studies, listening to lots of stories. I'm sure you listen to a fair amount of stories, spoken stories. Um,
Yeah.
so that was one part of it. And then the other thing that you mentioned too was so the keyword heaviness. I
Mm.
see that you're connected with my friend Dario Paniagua.
Yeah.
He talks a lot about one of the tests he has for graphic recordings. He has a young daughter, and what he does is he gives it to her, and he has her read them. In a past episode of the podcast, I interviewed him, and he talked about that. He pulled up some of my work. I didn't know he was going to do this, and he started reading it. And he said, a lot of the graphic recording or sketchnoting maps, he calls them,
Yeah.
you read them and they don't make any sense because it's just keywords, this, and there's no connectivity to it.
Mm.
And he found that the best ones are ones where you can read it almost like a sentence. I mean, there's still visuals in it, but
Mm.
there's some thinking of like visual structure that makes it fit together.
Yeah,
I
like
think
visual
would that be
grammar.
a fair way to what you're kind of describing? It sounded to me a little bit like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think visual grammar, which is so different to linear grammar, but is really,
Mm-hmm.
really important. Um, and flow in the work direction as well, guiding, I suppose, the eye, which is something you learn in
Mm,
kind of the fine arts as well in a different
mm-hmm.
way, but it's connected. To guide someone through a piece of work. Uh, um, and it depends on what you're trying to create as well. So, you know, whether it's something that's very, very orderly or it's something that actually has many directions, and like sometimes you're capturing a talk and it's 1, 2, 3, 4, and you really need to
Mm,
understand that structure. And sometimes you're capturing a conversation that is voluminous and it goes over, days or many hours, and actually it can be read in many ways. And as long as there's
mm,
somewhere for the eye to rest and there's connections that make sense, you don't have to block it off to be, unidirectional. It can actually be,
mm,
more multi-directional. And I think it depends, what the kind of information you're dealing with, and also what effect you want it to be having, where you think it will be seen. Is it going to be in a place where people can stand and consider it for time, or is it going to be something that people are scrolling past and you really need to
mm,
have ultra clarity to get
mm.
straight to them? Yeah.
That makes me wonder too. I guess I've thought of this before, but this idea that the talk itself, so you, as much as you control like what you hear and what you place, you have that degree of control, whatever that percentage is. There's got to be some percentage, maybe it's small, 5, 10, 15%, where the talk itself drives the structure, right? Like if somebody is distracted and they're jumping around to different things, like you can correct that to a degree,
Mm.
but like the core of the talk is distracted and jumping in all these places, and that's probably going to come through a bit in the visual, as much as you try to maybe not include it, or am I
Yeah.
wrong in that?
Um, yeah, I mean, I think that depends. Sometimes a speaker is basically a gift, and they have a really
Mm-hmm.
clear structure, and they tell you where they're going to go, and then they actually go there,
Mm-hmm.
and then they summarize it, and you're like,
Right.
ah, beautiful, you've done
Yeah.
half the work. And sometimes it's more distracted, and then, there's part of, I mean, working spatially means that you can, as they jump back and forth, you can group in a way that they haven't.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So that is possible. Sometimes, I mean, you're working with the material that you get, and sometimes if it's a very, very confused speech, like there are limits to what you can do in the moment.
Right. Right.
Joyfully with digital, you can move things around a little bit afterwards, but
Yeah.
in the paper world, it's what is there is there.
It is. It is what it is. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
That's really interesting. Well, and it sounds like now we've sort of come up to current date, talking about sort of your experience and where you came from. Really
Mm,
fascinating to hear all those different experiences and the way you approach things. It's funny that you said something about yours being a little bit more wordy. I think my default tends to be more wordy as well.
mm,
People are surprised by this. Like when I wrote my book, I really wrote the text first. Probably because I was a reader first as a kid. I did drawing, but reading was sort of
mm,
my source. So like my whole book was first written, and once I had the manuscript structured, then I went and I illustrated the structure. So there was probably structure in my head, and I see that occasionally where, visualizations are maybe a little bit more wordy, but I kind of appreciate that in some
Mm,
cases. Unless it's, just all words. I mean, obviously
yeah,
that would be at the other extreme. I don't think that's too common.
yeah,
People probably wouldn't necessarily pay for that unless it was, functional something where you're just in this facilitation space where you're getting stuff on a board, and maybe then you reprocess it into something more refined, I guess, at a later time.
yeah. But I think in the words, there's something about as well, like the human expression that people use when they're
Mm.
talking that they don't write down. And those things
Mm-hmm.
are really, for me, really key to capture. Like language is so colorful when we use it in the day to day.
Mm-hmm.
Speak as warm bodies in a room, and as things get formalized and written down and things, that can get reduced. So I think that's
Yeah.
where I like to be like, I'm going to capture that whole phrase because everyone who's there going to remember
Mm-hmm.
the way that that was said and the emotion behind it. And yeah.
Hmm. I think this is going to sound really strange, but I've been playing around with Grammarly. It's this third-party tool which will
Mm,
help you, I guess, correct your grammar and make you spell things better and such. And I just wrote an article recently, and I was frustrated a little bit with it because I think the way I write is I write the way I speak, and I
mm,
want to capture that. I want that to be in the in the way I write. Like it
yeah.
sounds like I'm telling it to you. Like if I were to read it, it would sound like I'm talking. And I found that this Grammarly tool would like make these recommendations. Like, no, I don't want that. That may be technically correct, but I don't want it to sound that way. I want it to sound like I'm thinking it or I'm saying it, which is kind
Yeah.
of fascinating. You're talking about this. We say things and then it gets kind of compressed and corrected into this readable form, which is
Mm,
not what we necessarily exactly what we said,
yeah.
which goes even farther back to your, you know, these stories that people told that were all, you know, oral discussion, right? There was
Right.
nobody writing it down necessarily, right?
Right. And I was absolutely fell in love when I first came across authors who wrote in the vernacular, like
Mm,
Toni Morrison and William Faulkner, and people who would write
mm-hmm,
the way, and of course they were writing about specific communities and
mm-hmm,
with their own dialects and accents and everything, but the writing would flow the way our minds work, the way our conversations happen,
mm-hmm,
um, and sometimes do away with formal grammar altogether, and certainly correct spelling and all of that kind of thing. But it was just understandable in this direct and innate way that sometimes formal language, we sort of have to bring it in and then understand it. It's not as
mm-hmm.
natural or direct
Direct,
to
I
the
guess.
system. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
I think I remember encountering that when I read Grapes of Wrath by Steinbeck.
Yeah,
The way he would describe these machines running across the landscape, and like his descriptive was like, wow, I've never read anything like this. And it really influenced me at that point, at that time, to want to do more description. Like he was almost like he was painting a picture with words. I don't know how else
yeah,
to describe that.
yeah,
So that I found really fascinating. So I think there is a connection between literature and, visualization. It's all part of human communication
yeah. And
that we're trying to
storytelling.
express, right?
Yeah, and it's
Mm-hmm.
a naturally multidisciplinary art is graphic recording.
Mm-hmm.
You're a user of words and images in a way that's
Mm-hmm.
sort of actually in some ways kind of untraditional for each. It's not the images are to stand alone, and it's not the words in their strict logical flow. It's okay, what happens if we mash these up? Um, which I guess there's very
Mm-hmm.
long traditions of as well. But it's
Yeah.
it's a bridge. It's a bridge between modalities of thinking, um, which
Mm.
kind of in that way um, gives broader access, I think, because you can come in through the words and then let the visuals help you. Come in through the visuals and
Mm-hmm.
let the words help you.
Yeah, and even if
Mm.
you move to like, I think about music, like you're trying to express emotion,
Mm-hmm.
and all these things that we talk about, if you think about it, they're still limited in some way. You can't fully express your feelings or the things you're thinking. You're giving a reduced set that can be absorbed, right? Because we don't have the capacity to, mind meld like Dr. Spock and see someone's thoughts or feelings or emotions, right? So it's even the best of times, it's still a pale expression of what we think and feel, right? So it's by its nature, it's limited to some degree.
Yeah.
Hmm. This got really philosophical. This is fun. It's really interesting to think about these things. Just why we have guests like you on the show to sort of go in different directions.
Yeah. Well, I guess what you said,
Um,
everyone comes from somewhere different. And
hmm
yeah.
Yeah, and hopefully, someone's coming to this and they feel aligned with where Blanche is coming from. That's the point of this, is to really provide different perspectives on how to come into this. And of course, the limitations, like we do our best, but we are limited. And I think, you know, doing the best we can does communicate. And hopefully what we're trying to do is, like you said, like, just a block of text, you can read that at any time, but a
Mm,
visual adds another layer, and maybe sound would add another layer. And whatever we're doing, we're trying to communicate these ideas in as direct as way as we can.
yeah.
So I do think
Like,
visuals are another way.
yeah, I think it's very much like building bridges between people, between
Hmm.
ideas, being building
Hmm.
bridges in all these different directions, creating ways in to the theme, creating ways in um, to connection. Um,
Hmm.
yeah, I feel like one little piece that I haven't, I don't know, maybe you have another question, but something that I have in my mind that feels relevant in this space, if we're talking about like all the different places we come from, is we also have
Hmm.
like a place that's sort of, I did a little bit of training in art therapy, which
Hmm.
is a place that has a vocabulary for things that I have understood for a very long time, about the way
Hmm.
that art works. But that, and also like the accessibility of like anyone can draw, and
Hmm.
it has so many functions, and some of them are communicative and some of them are emotional, and
Hmm.
some of them, well, have all of those pieces involved together. And so then when you, being a graphic recorder, so part of the facilitation can be participatory and creating
Hmm.
spaces where people can bring their voice either by writing or drawing their own pieces to, add to some co-creation piece,
Hmm.
or by sharing their voice and then seeing it represented by somebody else. But so that's a space that I'm also really interested in, where
Hmm.
there's being the graphic recorder, but there's also like opening that space and everything that it,
Hmm.
it potentially contains, those tools, to more people, um, to anyone who's interested or to anyone who thinks that way. Um, yeah, and that's something that I
Hmm.
feel is very beautiful place to explore and important.
Hmm. Yeah, I agree. I think having that would speak to being in person, right? There's some advantage to being in person. I think you can, to some degree, do this remotely. It's probably a little tougher
Mm,
being in person. I think of the story I have is I used to do this kind of graphic recording or facilitation around interface, because I'm a user interface, user experience designer by day. That's what I
mm-hmm,
do for my main work. And I was in a situation where we had a team of developers had come and we had a big whiteboard, and I would listen to what the tool was and how we were going to add this feature. So I would listen to what they were saying and be drawing on the board. And I remember there's one this one guy would say, "How are you reading my mind?" Like, well, you were telling me exactly what you were. I was just drawing what you were saying. But the best moments in those environments where when someone would have an idea and I wasn't quite capturing it enough, so I would offer the marker, and they would come and they would always say, "Oh, I can't draw as well as you can." I'm like, it doesn't matter, just do it anyway. And
yeah,
they would draw on the board and express. And those sessions were the best. Often it was a very difficult feature that was complex, and it took us. I remember one that was. It took so long for us to process. I think before we began, I think I drew like a gravestone or something and said, rest in peace, this feature when we finished. And but that was one of the features that really was well done, because we really thought about it from all these perspectives, and it involved everyone. Like if someone would say, well, who designed this feature, it's like we all did. We were all in the room,
mm,
we all contributed, we all guided, we all, some people even came up and drew on the board that weren't Mike. And we ultimately, it was, the purpose was not to do the drawing, the purpose of the drawing was to do the feature.
mm-hmm,
So it was in a lot of ways a means to an end.
yeah.
But those are the most exciting moments, is when everybody was involved and we were all like, they were sort of buzzing at the end of it. I don't know how else to describe that, but it was really fun.
There's a line I have in a song that's like, "There's nothing made that beats the joy you get from making." So
Mm.
there's,
Hmm.
and it's not just joy; it's also connection. It's also like that buzzing is, I don't know what, endorphins, like things reaching your
Yeah.
brain and things connecting. Um, and it's sort of ex- that experience expands your capacity, your memory, your future
Mm,
creative thinking, all of that. So that's a
mm.
beautiful example of that happening. Mm.
Yeah, that's very. It's. I still remember it. That was, I don't know, 2016, 2017. So years and years ago. And I still, when I see those people, they mention it too. So it was clearly impactful
Yeah. When
on
did you
them as
start?
well.
When did you start graphic recording?
Well, I don't know if I didn't know what graphic recording was actually.
Yeah.
I sort of stumbled into sketchnoting on my own because I was frustrated
Mm.
back in 2007. But it had been going on a long time before that. If you look back to David Sibbett and maybe even some of his contemporaries were doing it in the 70s, maybe even the 60s, sort of visualizing discussion. And I suspect it's been going on longer than that under different names.
Absolutely.
So I really just stumbled into it, and I didn't know that graphic recording was a thing until I met the organization, and turned out that we were kind of doing similar stuff. So it
Mm.
was pretty interesting to stumble into this space with my people. Hey, these are my people.
Yeah.
So
Like you're already doing
it
it,
worked
and
out.
then hey.
Yeah, yeah. So that was really great. So yeah, well, this has really been fascinating to kind of unpack your history and how all this sort of, we're kind of opening up the space to look at sort of what you do from all these perspectives. Really fascinating. I'm glad we had a chance to open that up and you were willing to.
Yeah. No, thank you for proposing the conversation.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. So I think now we, unless you'd like to add anything, it sounds like we're sort of at your your space where you're at. You're
yeah.
now independent, of course. You're appreciating all the selling and all the paperwork and all the logistics that the company did for you, which now you have to do on your own. Um,
Exactly. But also you
but
get to like there's hardness to it, and there's also actually being able to accompany a
control.
whole process,
Yeah,
control,
yeah,
and I don't know, thoroughness, detail, being able
yeah,
to,
yeah.
yeah, with,
Participate from end to end. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. It's beautiful too.
and
It's
in
hard work.
and I guess influence too, right? I mean, it's not, you sort of hinted at this before, like you think of facilitation as my customer wants to achieve this thing. They don't know how to get there. They have
Mm,
all this material or they have no material. How do we how do I facilitate them getting to this endpoint with my experience, knowing kind of what they want to achieve? That's kind of fun, right? You're, in a lot of ways, you're facilitating them achieving what they want to express, which is a little different than like being in the room facilitating.
yeah, it
In
is.
some ways, it's the same and different. I don't know, but
Yeah, and it has a lot of back and forth, and like, yeah, it's sort of ping ponging ideas back and forth, and going through
hmm,
iterations and finding the unique shape for that particular thing. And then, of course,
yeah,
it's really nice if what they're communicating is something that you really want to support
right.
as much and as often as possible, which I
Hmm.
feel like happens quite naturally, which is very, very lucky. Um, but yeah, exactly.
That
Facilitating.
might be the
Mm-hmm.
that could be the benefit of having your own firm, right? Where you
Mm-hmm.
get to choose like those people. While I could do that work, maybe it just doesn't quite align with what I want to do right now. But that client really aligns, and so it's a little bit easier to make that. And you have that choice, right? It's
Yeah.
not, you're not, hey, they emailed me, hey Blanche, can you do this thing? We got two other people. Are you in?
Mm-hmm.
Right? And then you have to make a choice, maybe not even fully understanding like what the ask is,
Yeah,
other
or
than you show
even
up
who the
and do
client
the
is,
stuff. Right.
sometimes. Yeah, no, absolutely. And I really, that's a really important part of working for yourself is you can decide who to work
Hmm.
with and where to go into, and whatever work you show, your portfolio and all of this, like that's what will come towards you. So for me, that's
Yeah.
one way to make that choice is I choose what to show, and that's naturally fed that I don't think I have anything that I wouldn't want to show
Mm-hmm.
from quite a few years of work.
Hmm.
Um, but because also of that kind of natural feedback loop. Yeah,
Yeah, what you do attracts more of what you want to do, right? So
exactly.
I
Yeah.
think that's a really good way to think of it. Something to remember too when you're faced with that decision, like, I don't know if I feel good about this. Like that might be a red flag to say maybe it's not for you, right? Even though it's good work and maybe you need the money,
Mm,
maybe if you're not proud of it, maybe that's a flag to
yeah.
for you to pay attention to. Yeah.
Yeah. I think, I don't know if I thought this or I probably heard it somewhere, but like just the idea that that's a great opportunity for someone but not
Yeah.
me, not me right now. Like for whatever
Yeah.
reason, like great opportunity. But, after the first years of starting off on your own and taking everything that comes and feeling like you should never say no,
Hmm.
like learning to be like, it's okay to say no sometimes, like,
Hmm.
um, that's also an important part.
Hmm.
Mm.
Yeah, it's part of the whole decision making process.
Yeah,
And I think if you're not into it either, you're not going to be helpful to the customer. So you're really not serving them as well. So I
absolutely.
mean, it serves both you and them to
Yeah,
find the right person.
yeah,
Interesting. The Sketchnote Army podcast is brought to you by the Concepts Sketchnote Workshop Video, a unique, free, hands-on workshop video where I show you how I use the Concepts app to create sketch notes on an iPad Pro with an Apple Pencil. In this 1 hour, 18-minute video, I cover the infinite canvas as a sketchnoting power feature, how vectors give you complete control of brushes and sizing as you create sketch notes, and how vector elements let you size and repurpose your drawings for ultimate flexibility. The workshop video includes answers to common questions about concepts. Watch the workshop video for free at rodesign.com/concepts. Be sure to download the Concepts app at concepts.app and follow along with me during the workshop. See you there. Well, this would be a good time for us to switch into tools. Now, it sounds like you do some analog, or at least you have. It sounds like you do digital. You hinted at that as well.
mm.
Let's start with the analog tools, and pens, pencils, notebooks, paper, any kind of things that you find are helpful in the work you do. That might be something interesting for someone listening to go check out and play with. Maybe that's their thing, and they've just never heard of it before.
Yeah. Well, okay. The first thing that comes to mind is for me, the most simple and the most obvious is having a sketchbook and just that personal practice. That means that your visual world is always alive and growing. And I make my own sketchbooks most of the time, so that's not very helpful. But
I was going
it's
to ask
something
that.
a really nice thing
Yeah.
that you can do. It's the simplest thing in the world. Fold paper, tear paper, make some holes and stitch it up. Put some kind of cover on that you like. But yeah, finding materials that really feel good to you. So you want to touch them every single day, and I love, and for that, I love watercolors, and I like soft pencils. So where you can make the softest line and the heaviest line with the same tool and just lean into it and make a change. Let's see. In my early days of graphic recording, it was all on foam board because that was what the agency did. I really do like the finish sometimes of foam board, but I don't like the ecological aspects, especially if I don't think they're going to keep it and use it.
Right.
Now that everything is so digital, very often they'll take the digital image out and throw it away.
Chuck it.
So my preference is now paper, and then just there's many papers. There's one I find in a local shop that it's sort of almost like a canvas-like weave. Still quite light, but it has a little bit of texture, which is nice. And then actually on live graphic recording work, I still like to use pencils, although in the end I go with the marker. I have quite a sketchy style, and so with a pencil I can be free and create a sketchy style, and then on top of that work with the marker. Not always, if there's time, 2 layers is not always possible. But yeah, so that's for the analog, and I suppose I'm one of many to use Newland because they're refillable and just
excellent work, excellent tools.
As well as being excellent tools, and they're refillable, and that's great. And then also in recent times, I can't remember what they're called. Marlowe? Maybe we could put it in the show notes.
Molotov, was that it? Molotov?
I think so. Yeah. They're also like refillable, kind of acrylic markers that you can get really great colors in and mix your own colors and everything.
I think that's also a German brand, if I'm not wrong. I think that's a German-based brand.
Yeah, and I went to their shops and it looks like all kind of like graffiti stuff, but it works really well for this.
Yeah.
And also something else that I really enjoy, although it's maybe I wouldn't do this on every job, but like paper cutout, like cutting out signs, cutting out lettering, like cutting out creatures, making skyline profiles, depends the time you have and the budget and if you're doing preparation or
Right.
not. But that can be like another like physical element that's just
Mm.
really nice to have. Um, yeah. So that's
Hmm.
mm,
Interesting. Soft pencils, handmade notebooks. I did see there was a short course from Domestika on making your own books. That
mm,
could be interesting for someone to look up. I can see if I can find a link to that.
yeah,
Um, I know my friend Mauro Toselli was really into hand making books. They were pretty simple with paper.
yeah.
Um,
And I
is there a
meant
size that you like? Is there a size like for the when you go to the tube,
um, yeah.
like
So
quite
I
small?
quite like
Okay.
this size, and then they change shape. But I tend to like the tall ones also because I write a lot, so it's writing
Mm,
and drawing. And
okay.
mine are really rough around the edges, and I think that's what I
Mm,
encourage anyone who wants to do it. Like it doesn't all need to be neat. I don't cut paper, I tear it. Um,
mm,
they're very rough and very lovely. You can make them as finished as you want, but it's
mm.
actually a very accessible way of um, creating something that feels unique for yourself. Mm.
I would think too, if you've just torn the paper and sort of put it together yourself, it's a little less precious in some way. That when I first bought moleskins, like I had a resistance to use them because they were too beautiful to use. I thought I would wreck it, and I
Mm.
learned, doing teaching, I just bring a ream of printer paper and hand out the paper and mark and a simple marker, right? Because so you screw it up, you crumple it up, and we recycle it. It's life goes on.
Yeah, that's great. Any tools that help with perfectionism are great because that's um, perfectionism or fear of breaking the blank. I mean, graphic recording is great for that anyway because it's when the event starts and you're like, I don't know what's going to happen, but it's going to happen,
Yeah, that's the fun
and
part. Yeah,
then
I think.
exactly. Um,
Hmm.
hmm,
The other tidbit I thought about too, as you talked about shifting from foam board to paper, and that you specifically liked a paper with a little texture, because I think for most graphic recorders that I've encountered,
mm,
they like a smooth paper with very fine, if any, tooth. Where it sounds like you're actually okay with that, and maybe that's because you're coming from an artist perspective, that maybe you actually like the feel of that. Maybe it gives the look that you're trying to hit with the
yeah,
pencil that you lay. Huh?
yeah. I think there's something about the actual experience. So like
Hmm.
the texture, you're
Yeah,
working
feeling it.
with material, you get that little bit of resistance. It's kind of um, I think I'm quite like a foam mark maker, and so I like to feel that
Hmm.
kind of resistance. Um, and then, yeah, also the finish looking at something.
Hmm.
We live in such a world of screens, and everything on screens is
Yeah.
flat and shiny and
Hmm.
textureless. And so
Yeah,
for
that's true.
an actual thing that's in space with you, like for me, the more like texture and presence it has,
Hmm.
I don't know, there's more connection for me.
Hmm. That's it.
Mm,
That's just an observation. Pretty interesting. Sounds like pretty much stuff you can get at any art store
for sure.
if you're listening. Soft pencils, uh, texture paper, tear it up and make it into a book. Rolls of it on it. It might be interesting for maybe a graphic recorder who's listening to, who's got art training. Maybe they challenge themselves and go with a little bit textured paper this time on the next job and just
Yeah,
see how it feels. Pretty interesting. And then you mentioned that you use digital. I assume you're using an iPad. What's the tool of choice that you like?
I am indeed on the iPad. I actually started with in the very early days of the pandemic before I had the an iPad and I hadn't fully moved into digital. I just
Mm.
made the leap as everybody else did at the same time. And I was using a computer that overheated regularly and
Ah,
a Wacom tablet that
yeah,
had
yeah.
about like a
Hmm.
3 second delay. So,
Oh boy.
you're just going on faith that like what you're doing down here is going to appear up there. So I was
Eventually.
eventually, uh, that was very nerve wracking. But when I got my hands on an iPad, I was like, oh, okay, yeah, this is better. Um, so I use iPad, I use Procreate, as do many colleagues.
Hmm.
And then other programs that I find really useful are um, the Adobe world, because actually, apart from the actual graphic recording itself, very often you're either taking photographs of work, in uneven conference hall lighting,
Hmm.
um, and on crinkled paper or something, and you need
Yeah.
and I do a bit of photography as well. So I've got Lightroom is really great for
Mm.
getting a really even light on
Corrections.
everything for
Hmm.
corrections. Obviously Photoshop as well. And there's a lot of pinging back and forth. So maybe like take the photo,
Mm,
send it um, into Lightroom, clean it up, the light, and then send it into Photoshop and clean up the
mm,
and some other aspects, and then send it back into Procreate and
mm.
add some extra drawings because you can. So there's sort of whole. Sorry, it's just started to hail. I think. I hope that's not too loud.
That's the life of a podcaster.
Yeah. But yeah, so all of those tools I find really useful in different ways, and I think that there's loads also like I have the Adobe because I use it a lot, but there's a lot of free tools that do all the same
Hmm.
things. And it's just finding the ones that work for you. Uh, Also, like,
Mm,
I often find it's really unexpected what's going to help. So, like, in the last project I did, was doing basically an illustrated booklet, front to back, the whole thing.
mm,
It was quite like a large project. There were like 12
mm.
illustrations in it or something. And it was
Wow.
for a printed piece, which I love because I'm like, oh, I have a beautiful project. Uh, yeah, equality in schools and really lovely thing. And I was really happy to know that it was going to be printed, but also was talking to them about like other ways of accessing it for people who weren't there that
Mm,
day or things like this. And I've used InDesign a lot for not normally this kind of work, but for creating catalogs for exhibitions, for
mm,
um,
mm,
creating liner notes for album artwork, all this kind of thing.
mm,
And I was like, hey, I can make you an online PDF booklet where people can also
mm,
go online and, it's got the sound whoosh whoosh as the pages go over, and people
mm.
can use an index to click back and forth and find all the pieces. So,
Interesting. Well, that's really cool that you gave them an additional space that they maybe hadn't thought of. Thought of the physical.
mm,
This provided something a little bit more
yeah, I think
interesting.
all the tools cross pollinate in the end. It's like there's almost nothing you
Yeah.
learn that isn't useful somewhere down the line. That's what
Mm,
I'm learning.
mm.
Mhm.
And the hail is back. The hail is back.
Yes, maybe that's a sign.
It's coming in waves.
So,
Um, so let's talk a little bit about tips that you might offer for someone. So this is a good spot where I frame it that maybe someone listening who's a graphic thinker of some kind. Maybe maybe they need some inspiration. Maybe they're just in a plateau and they need some encouragement. What would be three things you would tell them? Can be practical, they could be theoretical, to help them maybe go to the next level or just think of things a little differently.
one would be to trial different ways into the same activity. So
Mm,
I did one recently that was uh, challenging myself to only draw, so not to write, and then to go in afterwards
mm.
and give writing to the drawings,
Annotate. Yeah.
annotate exactly, and not necessarily with exactly the words that were said, but also like pulling from the drawings, so you can.
Mm,
And then maybe you come out with something that was more synthesized than something came out in a long way. And instead of immediately writing all of that down and then trying to find an illustration for it, you go straight to the sort of visual meaning and then extrapolate back into words. So that's a fun
interesting.
thing.
Hmm.
Experiment and find your own style. Like you said, there's a lot of people, some graphic recording can fall into a very similar style, and it's useful to have templates, but also like mess around with different materials
Hmm.
and brushes or pencils, or even digitally brushes and Procreate, whatever it is, like to find something that feels yours.
Hmm.
Um, I would recommend. Um, I don't know what other things. Keep a sketchbook. Only show the work you want to do. I'm just repeating myself
Hmm.
now, but those are things I think that are really important. Um, and I think uh, don't underestimate all the background work to being
Hmm.
an entrepreneur, as an artist
Hmm.
in any way, in any field. And appreciate that part that you do as well.
Hmm.
Mm.
That's good to remember, especially even if you're someone who does it on the side. Appreciate all the work that not only that it's like you could really easily fall into the trap. Oh, I have to talk to the client. I have to do this. I have to do that. Like that can sort of lead you in a place where you think of it negatively.
Mm.
Sometimes, this idea that I get to do,
Yeah.
right? It could be a really interesting mental shift where, yes, you have to do it, but you also get to do it. If you're responsible, you can change it, right? That's where you want to be, because then you can adapt to the situation and or offer something that they had never thought of, right? So that's a
Yeah.
positive thing.
Yeah. There's
So
a quote I heard the other day. Oh gosh, I really hope I'm right saying it was Toni Morrison. It's freedom is the freedom to choose your own responsibilities. And I feel like as an entrepreneur, kind of thing, it's that, very much to remember that, because a lot of things can feel like obligation, and there are favorite and not favorite parts of every process. But stepping into that space and taking those pieces on that's a chosen freedom. That makes sense.
Interesting. The other quote I remember is from Mike Tyson, the boxer, has this quote. He says is that I forget exactly how to say it, but it was something along the lines of discipline is doing the things you hate like you love them. So like, that was pretty deep, right? Like, what if you took the things you hated to do, that you acted like you loved them, like training and doing all the things, that getting up at 5 a.m. to do the thing that you don't want to do? What would happen if you switched your mindset to say, I love doing that? That's kind of an interesting perspective, I guess, along the similar lines of opportunity and choosing your responsibilities. Another thing as well.
Yeah, nice.
This is the philosophical episode for those who've made it this far. We're just talking about philosophy all over the place.
Sorry, I don't know if that was the plan, but I've enjoyed it.
No, this is fantastic. Yeah, no, I love it. I love each episode is unique, and each person brings their own unique perspective, and I appreciate the work that you're doing, Blanche. I love that you're doing it so uniquely, that you're not necessarily following a pattern, that you're following your own way. I think that's really great, because that encourages other people who see your work to do the same thing. I think we need more personality and variety, and instead of everyone getting squished into all doing the same thing, like that would get quite boring. So I'm glad that you're doing that, and I appreciate that you are doing it and following your path that makes sense to you. So thank you.
It's a wiggly path, but I'm on it.
Good.
Yeah.
Well,
okay.
now this would be a good time to ask, what are the best places to connect with you, to see more of your work, to find you? Where are the places that you hang out? I know we cross paths in LinkedIn. You're Blanche Illustrates on LinkedIn if you want to find her there. What would be some other good places to find you?
So for my graphic recording work and graphic facilitation work, that's all Blanche Illustrates. So that's my website, www.blancheillustrates. It's my LinkedIn, and on Instagram as well, Blanche Illustrates. And then my personal artwork and some music can be found at Blanche Ellis Art, which is, it's quite a different aesthetic, a different world. And through there's links to other places. I have music on Spotify, on YouTube, on all around the place, just under my name, Blanche Ellis. So,
okay.
Yeah.
Great. So Blanche Ellis, or BlancheIllustrates.com is the one that I see here. That's got your work.
Yeah.
Work.
Exactly. My work. And then there's, a million personal projects always running behind, and most of them are under Blanche Ellis Art. And exactly.
Okay, great. Well, we'll put those in the show notes for sure, and let people connect with you and find you. And thanks so much for being on the show. It's been really fun to have you and have this very deep discussion. I think it's good. Every now and then we get into these deep discussions. I look forward to them. So thank you for participating and sharing that with me.
No, thank you. I've really enjoyed that. And as I said to you at the start, I'm not a public speaker, so I really appreciate speaking with someone who makes that really easy and enjoyable.
Yeah. No, you did great. You're a really fascinating person. So for those who are listening or watching, it's another episode of the podcast. Until the next one, we'll talk to you soon.
Ciao.
The Sketchnote Army podcast was created by me, Mike Rohde, and brought to you by Rohde Design Studios. It's produced and edited by Alec Polianis of Amp Creative Studios. The theme music was created by John Schiedermeyer. To support the creation of this show, I invite you to buy one of my books, the Sketchnote Handbook or the Sketchnote Workbook. You can find the books on Amazon, or go to peachpit.com and use the code ROHDE40 for 40% off. Please share this podcast with other visual thinking friends, and be sure to leave a nice rating on iTunes or your favorite podcast listening app so others can find the show.